So, welcome everybody. It's so glad to have so many of you joining. My name is Meelika Hirmu, and I am a coordinator at the Salto Participation and Information Resource Center. And we are all here joining the webinar of series called Making Youth Participation Visible. And this webinar that we are having here today is called Participation and Information for a Sustainable Green Europe. And during today's webinar, we will be discussing what can we learn from environmentalism and how can we better promote youth participation. So we will take a look at exciting new trends. We will explore the history of environmental activism and young people. We will also take a look at how young people become environmental activists in the first place. And of course, our speakers will be sharing do's and don'ts, their own learning moments, and so much more. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you first our amazing speakers. And first, I would like to introduce Johanna Schwarz. Johanna can wave at us. And she is a United Nations youth representative. She is also a climate activist herself, a moderator and a speaker, and as well a strong advocate for youth participation in international politics. So she has many hats and she's very, very active. A second speaker is Sarah Haji Amr. Hi, Sarah. She is also a young climate activist, and she has been a member of Youth Council of the Generationenstiftung, which in English means Generation Foundation. And she intensively looks into the questions of climate, global justice, and human rights. So both of our speakers are young climate activists, experts. They are looking at the topic from very different angles. And additionally, I'm really happy to introduce you Siiri Taimla. Siiri, please wave to everyone. She is our graphic recorder who has extensive experience with conferences and events, and she'll be making this online experience more fun and inspirational as she is drawing these events here live in front of our eyes. And last but not least, my kind colleagues who are co-organizing this series of webinars, Georg Feiner, a coordinator at Salto Participation and Information, Kadri Maripu, our project officer, and Kelly Rupa, she's our assistant. So she'll be looking Facebook feed at the same time. All right, wonderful. So I would now very, very briefly like to introduce you guys what does Salto Participation and Information do. And for friends, we just call it Salto P&I or Salto Pi. So in case some of you don't know yet, I will share a few slides so that you can get to know us a little better. So Salto Participation and Information Resource Center is part of 7 European resource centers who work in the field of youth. And we are there for the youth sector to help bring in new knowledge. And obviously, we all organize different events and trainings and so on and so forth. So similarly, also Salto Participation and Information is having a mission to help the youth sector to become stronger. And especially in our case, we are here to foster youth participation across Europe. So we organize events, trainings, including this series of webinars. We publish different information materials and organize different kind of cooperation with different partners, and all with the same aim to foster youth participation. And some of our fields of actions more specifically are, for instance, media literacy. We're also developing promotion-related activities so that the youth sector could be more powerful in making their voice heard. And we have different ways of doing this. So, for instance, we have gathered amazing thinkers across Europe to advise on trends and developments of youth participation. We are at the same time also developing a participation strategy. And last but not least, and you will hear more about it, for instance, also participation resource pool, which gives all the useful materials for the youth sector to make participation bigger and make participation more visible. So that's very briefly about Salto P, but I also have some technical announcements so that you will be informed. And these things to keep in mind is that please bear in mind that this webinar is recorded and it is at the same time being live streamed on Facebook. So people will be watching. And we will bring the recording to you as well. So after the webinar ends, it will be available on YouTube with a transcript. You will get that information for you. And we will also publish this on the participation resource pool. So you can also watch it later. And in case you have questions, please use the questions and answers section on Zoom window. You can find it. If you need help, please let us know. And those who are watching us currently on Facebook, please feel free to post your comments in the comment section. So we'll be also looking at them and gather. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, we are so many, we are not able to accept all the questions and answer them, but we'll make a selection. And then also after the webinar, we will have a bigger selection of your great questions and answer them in a written form. So you will also find the written answer selection on the participation resource pool. So other than that, it's a webinar as the webinars go, and I would stop sharing my screen now. I have a little bit issues now, of course, with my mouse, but should be fine now. So I would now like to give the word over to Johanna, who will take over. And here you go, Johanna.
Thanks a lot, Melika, also for the introduction earlier. So hi, everyone. I am Johanna. As Melika said, I'm from Germany. I work in energy and mobility transitions in consulting, and also apart from that, I consider myself a climate advocate and also a youth participation advocate. Welcome to my kitchen, and hello to everyone across Europe. It's so great to virtually be together with so many people working on climate topics, environmental topics, and youth participation. So maybe a bit on how we structure this seminar. When I talked to Sarah, we decided that we wanted to start with giving you a couple of introduction points on the environment and youth participation across Europe before we dig a little deeper into the current movements that we see around environmental activism among young people. So when we talk about environmentalism, we really talk about the concern for and the action aimed at protecting the environment. So in contrast to environmental activism, environmentalism itself can also mean that you're only concerned about the environment and not really actively taking any action. Environmentalism and environmental activism can both be aimed at various topics and can address actually multiple topics or specific aspects surrounding the protection of the environment in total. So these can rank from conservation of biodiversity and wilderness protection over to environmental equity questions, to linking the environment to economic growth or the climate change activism or climate crisis question. So we wanted to dig a little deeper into some of the key questions surrounding environmentalism and young or youth participation in Europe. And we wanted to start with an input on environmental youth activism and how it developed in Europe. So really, there was no like starting point when environmental activism in Europe really started, because people have always been concerned about the nature, especially when they live off the nature or natural habitats. But one can really say that the environmentalism as we know it in modern times started in the 1800s with the Romanticism, where the Romanticism put emphasis on nature and on living in line with natural habitats and protecting natural habitats. And those movements sort of fueled the first large-scale environmental movements that popped up in the late 1800s as a result of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. So basically, a lot of young factory workers sued factories for polluting rivers and airs and protested against these factories. And that started the really sort of large-scale environmental movements as we know them today. In the early 20th century, environmental laws and agencies became a lot more prominent and widespread across Europe. So we saw less protest in environmental movements, but rather a focus on conservation in traditional environmental groups. Interestingly, one of the strongest environmental laws was established in Germany under the Nazi regime, as the Nazis saw environmental education of young people as part of their propaganda, and linking the protection of German forests to the protection of the German cultural heritage. So in that times, we saw a lot of young people being involved in youth groups established by the Nazi regime that also focused on environmental education. It's probably really the only good thing that they ever did. Then, environmental activism among young people changed again in the 1970s, as it was fueled by the student protests in the 60s. And during that time, in the 70s and 80s, a lot of influential environmental groups were founded, and a lot of them actually by young people or students. Greenpeace is a very prominent example that was founded during that time. Since then, we can say that young people have mostly been engaged in youth groups or NGOs. So we didn't really see any major protests until the discussion of the ozone layer protection in the 90s around the Rio conference in 1992. And after the Montreal Protocol was established, we really saw in the late 2000s a bit of a decline in the environmental movement until and you might all know that, it really sprung to a record high again when Greta Thunberg started protesting and initiating school strikes all across Europe. So to summarize that, we can say that young people have always been part of environmental movements and actually very often been at the heart or initiating environmental movements across Europe. But what we can definitely see from the history is that now people are a lot younger. So if you compare that to, for example, the student protests in the 70s or the protests in the 1880s of factory workers, those have always been young people, so in the early 20s. But if you now look at the school children striking, you see that young people that are environmentally active are becoming more and more young or younger for that sense. So did the type of environmental activism change over time? Yes, absolutely. We see that it became broader in line with the new opportunities such as social media. So young people are now involved in online petitions, in sort of new organizational structures such as think tanks are coming up with very creative ways of addressing environmental problems such as litter challenges, for example. We can also say that the type of environmental activism has always fluctuated in time between a lot more conservative approach, which is really focused on being active within environmental or established environmental groups, focusing on conservation efforts, and on the other hand, more disruptive activism. And really, when we look at how young people are engaged in the environment, we see that the type, so either conservative or more disruptive, is very much in line with the dominant youth culture at that time. So, for example, in the 70s, the student protests or the youth culture was really focused on differentiating yourself as a generation from your parents and what your parents did when they were young. So also the environmental activism was more disruptive than in earlier times. Today we see that young people are more and more not environmentally active within established structures such as youth groups or, I don't know, established environmental organizations, but rather have a more individualistic approach towards environmental activism. So they change their own consumer behavior. They go to Fridays for Future protests, for example. And this is fully in line with sort of the growing individualization of our societies that we see. However, it is also important to point out that environmental NGOs have also seen the strongest growth of under 27 membership base alongside to the Fridays for Future protests. So yes, a lot of young people do not necessarily see organizations as part of their environmental activism, but at the same time, the number of young members also grows in these organizations. Do we see regional differences in environmental youth activism? Yes, absolutely. So environmentalism used to be a fairly regional topic before the climate crisis and also sort of before the ozone layer discussion, which was really the first truly international environmental threat that we saw. So looking back, we really saw strong environmentalism across young people in areas with imminent environmental threats. As an example, we can take the infamous killer smog or killer fog in London in 1952, which killed around 4,000 people and led to the passing of the Clean Air Act, which was also driven partly by young people. We also see strong youth environmentalism in areas with intact ecosystems and natural habitats where young people live close to the environment. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Today, with the climate crisis being a truly global threat, we see environmental youth activism all across Europe. However, we do see regional differences regarding the types of activism, for example. So, as an example, in France, we see less young people school striking compared to other countries, but we do see a really strong use of online petitions to demand climate action. And in Russia, environmentalism among young people is still very strongly linked to conserving natural habitats as part of the Russian self-identity. Do we see a social segregation in terms of environmentalism? Yes, absolutely. That's also true. We do, if we look at environmental movements of young people in the history, they were always driven by one particular class. So if you think of, again, the student protests in the 70s, those were mostly well-educated upper or middle class students, while in the 1880s, it was dominantly factory workers that led these large-scale environmental protests. There are a couple of decisive factors whether one can join or that lead to the social segregation of young people in environmental activism. One is, and I've mentioned that now again, how close are you growing up to the environment? Do you have access to the environment or environmental goods? Do you have the time and money, so the resources to be active, or do you have to dedicate your time to, for example, making a living? And to what extent are you impacted by the threat to the environment? However, we also do see, if we look at, the environmental activism of young people and the history in Europe as a whole, that very often environmentalism was driven by young people in fairly privileged parts of society, so mostly the well-educated middle class, which is also true for the Fridays for Future movement, and Sarah will touch upon that in her talk a little. And then lastly, how do young people become environmentalists? That's actually a really interesting question, because there is a discrepancy between grey policy literature and academia. So lots of grey policy literature actually identifies young people as key stakeholders for environmental issues, and the United Nations did so as well in the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. However, academia has really not focused on young people as environmental activists in the sense of being initiators for change or agents of change, but only saw them or looked at environmental activists among young people as addressees of environmental action. So back in 2017, when I studied climate change, there were only 2 studies that were based on primary data collected from young environmentalists. And those studies show that there are 3 main points that are influential for the journey of young people to becoming environmentalists. First, the existence of early childhood experiences in nature, and the fact that you can be close to nature and you sort of have access to environmental goods. Secondly, the identification of influential role models. And thirdly, community experiences with peers at conferences and gatherings. So looking at role models, there was really no structured research on what constitutes effective role models. And when I talk about effective role models, I really mean role models inspiring young people to become environmentally active and take on leadership roles in sort of the environmental activism sphere. So I did write my master's thesis on what constitutes effective role models for young environmentalists. And I found a couple of interesting findings. So first, the role model characteristics vary based on the starting date of environmental activism. So kids tend to name their family role models as mostly influential, while the adolescents mostly talk about peers and teachers as their most important role models. And then young adults identify role models from environmental organizations as well as well-known environmental activists as sort of the most influential role model on their journey. Secondly, we do see a role model observer closeness. So basically all of my participants mentioned that their role models were coping role models. So what does that mean? It basically means that you have a role model whose behavior you feel you can copy or also recreate. Interestingly, all of these role models that they talk, so when I started my research, I assumed that all of the young environmentalists would highlight role models that were young themselves, because that would ensure that coping role model existence. So basically, you feel like you can also do something because that role model is a young environmentalist, him or herself. But interestingly, that wasn't true for all of the role models. They weren't per se young themselves, but they were perceived being young at heart and taking the concerns of young environmentalists seriously. So it could also be teachers that said, well, you have the right to, stand up, voice your concern. And then thirdly, all role models were also qualified or were perceived as being qualified as supporters by having the expertise and showing enthusiasm. So finally, what does that mean in terms of how we can encourage youth environmental action or activism? Well, if we look at the barriers that young people tell us who are not active, or the reasons why they are not active, they say they perceive a really strong external locus of control. So that means that the people perceive their own actions as insignificant and believe that only people with more power or expertise can create change. And if we look at climate change, that's actually a really, really dominating barrier for people not to get active, specifically young people, is that feeling of this external locus of control. Then they said they perceive a lack of peer support and then a lack of resources, including emotional support. So summing that up, there is evidence that young people as role models for environmental behavior are very influential and like impactful of empowering other young people to become environmentalists. We need people that are supporters, that provide the resources, have the expertise and the emotional support. And then we also need to focus really strongly on local environmental action, because that is like sort of making it easier for young people, like they feel they can actually do something and take control on an action, because that imminent environmental problem is a lot closer to them than, you know, globally climate change as a topic. And that was my hopefully 30 minutes rundown. I know it's been really broad and a lot of topics, but happy to cover more specifics and questions, also written form afterwards.
Thank you so much, Johanna, for this really interesting input and insights. Yeah, the participants here are getting more and more active. This is wonderful to see. So questions are coming in. Before I go to pick the first question to bring it out to you, Johanna, I would like to go back a bit and try to see how the participants are interacting with our system here, and if this works well. So I would like my colleague to start the poll now that we have prepared to get a little bit of insight also, where are you all from here? And then we have a second question that gives us a little bit of a feeling and insight, who are these 202 attendees that we have here on our Zoom, plus even more out there on Facebook. So this is really interesting. We have put out the question like grouped, so we didn't go country by country, but we are looking into the numbers like of which part of the world you're currently in. So the numbers are really high for the European Union, but that's not where all the participants are from. So the numbers are raising and raising also for other European countries, up to 17% now. Africa with 1%, Asia 6%, and elsewhere 4%. We have 163 votes already. So I think we can go to the second question that we have prepared for you. And in the same time, you still have a bit time to add some content questions for Johanna based on the presentation. You still see on the screen the key features that Johanna has been talking about, drawn so nicely by Siri. So now the second polling question is in progress, and I see the first answers are coming in. So 6, 7, 10 have already voted. Now it's really going up in the numbers. So I'm reading out to you where we stand here. So. All right, so now the poll results are in, and you can see that where you're all saying where you're from. So 23% say that you're youth activists, 43% say that you're working with youth, 31% say that you're working for a youth organization, So you also had the chance to tick more boxes at the same time. 8% are youth researchers, 12% work in public administrations and or in politics, and 51% of you are here for environmental reasons, and none of you doesn't know what this is and where you are. 2% are here for online dating. Interesting. I would love to see now who is behind these figures, but you can leave your comments in the chat on this as well. And 7% want to learn new things because you're bored in this situation, and 10% want to see humans. So thank you very much for this interaction and for joining in on this. Coming back to the topic, Johanna, your input provoked a number of very big questions already, and we'll just go into a few of it and take maybe the bigger ones to the moment we have after the input. I would love to start with a really interesting question raised right in the beginning. So the question was coming from Asena, who said that, yeah, it's kind of easy to have young people on board in this endeavor of climate change, but what about the older generation? How are we going to convince them? Short answer from your side, maybe. What's your recipe?
Yeah, I'm going to keep it real short because I know Sarah is the expert for intergenerational environmental justice, so and she's working on that. But I think my takeaway would always be make it emotional. So when we talk about climate change, it's really that, you know, big blurry topic that no one can really refer to. But once you make it emotional and you send an emotional message, like it is about my future, I am someone's child, I am someone's grandchild, you can make it, you can really encourage people to act. Or you can also make it very locally specific, so link it to certain reserves, natural reserves that you have, or like environmental features that you are living closely by. So that always works for me. And also accept like the fact that the older generation, yes, has some sort of you know, a history of unsustainable environmental behavior, but we shouldn't fuel the generational conflict, but rather get all together and say, hey, we can now fix it, or we need to fix it.
Great, thank you so much. I will just raise a few more of the questions so that we remember it for later, but then I will also already hand over the word to Sarah. So what I found really interesting as a question from coming from Clara was the question, how can we motivate those who are out there and rather apathic? How can we motivate and encourage them to join parties or even run for posts? Another question coming from Felipe was, how can the European youth be a better model and a better reference for other regions, because the highest polluters are out in other regions other than Europe. Then a last one from Christopher, who asked about effective ways and best practice examples, how to include social groups. So all really interesting questions, and we'll keep them in mind for later, but now it's the time where I can hand over the words to Sarah. And keep posting your questions in the Q&A section. We are taking really good care of those, look into them, and we will answer a few in this session and a few even later outside this session. Sarah, the word is yours.
Well, first and foremost, thank you to each and every one of you, 200 wonderful people, for being here on a Friday afternoon, and to Sauter PI for having me. I'm Sarah. Just like Johanna, I'm from Germany, and I have been active in a few different contexts. I've been an ambassador for climate justice with Plan for the Planet for the last 9 years, and at the moment I also work with the Generationenstiftung, which translates to Generation Foundation, an NGO trying to put generational justice on the political agenda. So I guess today I'll be filling the role of an activist who has been part of organized organizations, grassroots movements, and worked with youth in some well-established NGOs. So let's jump right in, I guess. The global climate protests called Fridays for Future mobilized more than 1.6 million people around the globe in March 2019, and the mobilization continues. This wave of climate protest mobilization is unique in its tactics, global scope, and appeal to teenage school students. And Fridays for Future is a historical turn in climate activism, I'd say. Never before have so many young people taken to the streets to demand climate action through symbolically forceful disobedience. And we'll talk about that at a later point in the form of a school strike. In my part of this webinar, I'd like to talk about why and how FFF and the likes motivate so many young people and what they are doing differently to thousands of other organizations out there. First of all, why does FFF mobilize so many young first-time activists? Of course, Fridays for Future is organized by and explicitly targets young people. The entire framing of this movement is about young people demanding that adults take responsibility for safeguarding their future. Adults participate, but do so mainly in solidarity with the young. Based on how social networks work, we can expect that an initially young core will gather a similarly young circle of protesters around itself. Another related reason why FFF is mobilizing so many young people might be Greta, who has shown that being young does not mean that you cannot have an influence on politics. The prominence of young and strong female leaders within the movement in general, coupled with relatively low entry barriers and practically non-existent hierarchies, which allow for fast individual growth within the movement, are major points that may attract young people to Fridays for Future. Getting a sense of self-efficacy and or impact, a feeling of being seen and heard within your own peer group, but also within the public discourse in such a short amount of time, and offering space for young people to speak their minds is something more established organizations haven't been able to offer in the past, really. Paired with a clear and precise and easily achievable call to action, which obviously is don't go to school on Fridays, but rather take part in a climate strike. This promises quick and very tangible impact, something many youth, especially after years of frustration, after failed climate negotiations and being ignored by the media and politics, desperately crave, really desperately crave. Offering many different ways to engage in the movement that fit our very highly individual and busy lives without demanding a lot of commitment from us, but still allowing us to feel like a part of something bigger. And keeping in mind the high number of newcomers within FFF, it is to be expected, as Johanna already said, that the role of environmental non-governmental organizations, or more well-established organizations, will not be of a crucial importance for school students. Well, but how can such a movement be sustained long-term and manage the different narratives existing among members without becoming just another NGO? The aforementioned aspects point towards the possible development of FFF into a new grassroots movement, able to significantly broaden the composition of climate protests, as we've seen in the last years. It would be unwise to either dismiss Fridays for Future as a passing trend built on Greta's media-based popularity, as many people would like to say, or to consider it a coherent and articulate political movement. There's just too many differences within the movement. And this makes answering this question quite difficult. But I'll try to point out a few key aspects which I believe to be crucial to sustaining any kind of global movement in the long term. The first problem is something really quite boring and mundane, but still essential. And this is managing financial and legal issues. Without any kind of official umbrella structure, in most countries, fundraising and organizing participants can be quite the challenge. Subsequently, there need to be ways to come to far-reaching decisions concerning the movement as a whole in a timely manner. Only then can they stay atop of their game In times of Corona and other global crises, we see that at least to some degree, these movements need hierarchies and structures to stabilize themselves and persevere. And most importantly, to keep their core mission. But what is crucial in these processes is to always remember the unique selling points of your organization or whatever, because it's easy to forget that the whole success of a movement is solely based on its participants and supporters. Therefore, their needs and wishes and ideas need to be the biggest concern in establishing official structures, but also in building networks within the movement. There need to be established ways that people can engage remotely, be part of decision-taking processes, and connect to other members around the globe. I also believe that every movement that demands any kind of personal risk or investment owes its members absolute transparency and honesty. This also means finding open and accessible processes to sound out the future direction and actions a movement will take, its core message and interests. Only through this, frustration and confusion within its participant group concerning the decisions taken can be discussed on a solid basis and then prevented, hopefully. And this is where I'd like to move on from Fridays for the Future onto the question on how we can send an even stronger message. Because apparently, thousands of students leaving classes, having almost 24/7 media coverage, and 1.6 million people on the streets are not enough to make a difference. Out of this frustration, some friends and I decided to write a book last spring. It's called You Don't Have a Plan, So We Made One, or we wrote in German, so the title would be Ihr habt keinen Plan, also machen wir einen, and offers solutions to 10 global issues ranging from the climate crisis to democracy and capitalism. We wrote it together with several scientists because we didn't want to hear that we had no idea because we were young people. Luckily, we were a top 10 best-selling book in Germany for 12 weeks, but that was not enough apparently. Youth got to speak in front of world leaders, were invited to the most amazing locations all over the planet for this summit or that summit, and still nothing. So what are we supposed to do? We'll get to that in a moment. I'm sure most of you have at least heard about civil disobedience, if not even participated in some actions. But I still want to give a short definition because this is such a broad term with so many implications and on so many different levels. On the most widely accepted account of civil disobedience, famously defended by Rawls, I believe, civil disobedience is a public, non-violent, and conscious breach of law undertaken with the aim of bringing about a change in laws or government policies. On this account, people who engage in civil disobedience are willing to accept the legal consequences of their actions, as this shows their fidelity to the rule of law. For many disobedience, their breach of law is demanded for them not only by self-respect and moral consistency, but also by their perception of the interests of their society. So to put it in more easy terms, for the greater good. Through their disobedience, they draw attention to laws or policies that they believe require reassessment or rejection. Famous examples for civil disobedience cases would be Gandhi's Salt March in the 1930s or Rosa Parks' bus boycott. And there are many different ways to define civil disobedience, and we could have a whole webinar filled with a discussion about morals and laws concerning this. But here is what I want you to take away from this definition. Civil disobedience is only one of many tools to bring about great change. Oftentimes it creates amazing pictures, like people storming a coal mine or blocking London with colorful banners, and it demands a great deal of dedication from its participants. People willingly putting themselves in high-risk situations, be it concerning their health and safety or their freedom, just because they believe in a cause so unconditionally is incredibly powerful for communicating urgency and the need for drastic measures. If people are willing to put their own existence on the line, it has to be for an important cause. But this is not the only way to initiate change. A lot of us don't feel comfortable putting ourselves in risky situations, and there can be thousands of absolutely valid reasons for this. But that doesn't mean that we can't start finding and using other, maybe even more powerful tools and methods of putting our concerns and visions on the agenda. We are a diverse society, and every group is reached and touched in different ways. So let's start thinking about how we can get the general public involved. It's time for unusual concepts, ideas taken out of context, and the appearance of activists in each and every part of our daily lives. Imagine 100,000 elderly people slowly marching towards buildings of parliament, joined by their grandkids, demanding a safe and just future for them. Imagine the inhabitants of the homes for the elderly in your city flooding the offices of local politicians with letters and postcards, asking him or her to take action. Join this with 1.6 million students on the street, even the usually so composed scientists taking a stance, with every part of our community putting more and more pressure on governments to finally put their citizens first. And I think we might have a fair and realistic fighting chance. I believe that there are many ways in which we, meaning you and me, and every individual we know, can become active while feeling comfortable and safe and listened to. There can be as much power in sending thousands of letters and postcards as there can be in storming coal mines. Our actions have to be just as diverse as we as a society are. There is no one tool to achieve great change. Each and every one of us has to acknowledge that he or she can be a catalyst for big shifts in civil society and politics, as much as we can be the grit in the gears of a system based on draining our planet of its resources and exploitation. Now you might ask yourself, but what if they just don't want to? With a few exceptions, talking to people, even though you might think, how could we possibly ever get on the same page, really does help. I remember sitting on a radio show once, talking about our book, which was just published, and answering calls from people all over Germany live for 2 hours. It was quite exhausting. People were so mad when they called. How dare we question their right to drive 5 big cars? How dare we this? How dare we that? But as soon as they had vented their anger and we finally got talking and listening, we noticed that we wished for the same things. Clean air, less pressure in our professional lives, a safe future for our maybe not even existent children. Wanting the best for future generations is something intrinsically human and something we can find common ground on in almost every situation. But we also have to talk about who is going to solve this crisis? Who has the most political and financial power? Who has the biggest interest in securing this just future? And how do we get these people to work together? Keeping our common ground in mind, intergenerational dialogues, which is what I do at the moment for a living, are a fun and easily scalable way of having productive and thought-provoking discussions. We have to accept that we all live in very different realities most of the times, and that what might be one of your biggest concerns doesn't matter to someone else, and the other way around. You might have noticed how I put special emphasis on the elderly while I was talking about becoming active. With most of the power being concentrated in the older parts of society, we have to find ways to get them on our side and truly involved as well. Let's give them a cause. They want to be part of something bigger just as much as we want. Some might call it building a legacy. Talking about Germany, over 13 million people are not allowed to vote. They are too young. 13 million people can't have a say in how decisions concerning their future are made. We need everyone to work on the problem of the environmental and the climate crisis. Young people have to overcome seemingly endless obstacles to do it. And without us young people, the older generations simply don't have a reason to.
Sarah, great, wonderful.
I have one more sentence.
One last sentence, and then we really like to take some questions
Yes.
from the audience because there are so many and I think they want to interact. So one last sentence.
Yes, let's stop defining generations by age and let's start a new generation defined by its drive for positive change. I worked so hard to translate this into English. I had to do it.
All right. I guess we forgive you.
Thank you.
Very amazing. And the questions, we have so many ask also still questions to Johanna. So please take into consideration that all the materials that Johanna has and mentioned, we'll gather them together and we'll gladly share it with all of you. But now a question to Sarah. There has been several questions regarding for instance, examples of an organization or an action that explicitly works on both climate change and social issues. And there are other questions mentioning, the segregation again, and then the different less fortunate groups. So can you give maybe like some examples of good projects, but really briefly? Thank you.
So for Germany, obviously, I'd say the Generationenstiftung, because not only do we work on the climate crisis, but also on all these social issues. So if you are German, feel free to message us. On a global scale, I don't think that there are a lot of organizations which work on each and every part of this, but I don't think that that's something that has to happen. I know that a lot of youth-led movements right now are trying to broaden their topics. They don't only want to talk about the climate crisis, but also about the social implications of the climate crisis and the justice aspects and democracy. I think Amnesty is working on something like this. Plan for the Planet is trying to broaden their subjects. Johanna, maybe you have some more ideas. I'm not really sure. If I have some more thoughts, I'll be sure to share them. Right now, spontaneously, nothing springs to mind. I know that also Fridays for Future is thinking about all these topics and the topic of global justice as well. So, yeah.
Wonderful. So actually, I would give the word to Johanna now. She can either comment real quick or move forward. And I remind you, please write your questions under the questions and A section, because in the regular comments, they might get lost within all the other comments. So it's easier for us as organizers to follow your questions and make sure that they get written down by us. So Johanna, please go ahead.
Sure. First of all, apologies for me being so slow to type. We will definitely answer all of your questions, but I'm just a really slow typer, so apologies for not having answered too many in written form yet. So in the sort of looking at the time we have, I would suggest we move forward to the next section. So what Sarah and me discussed, what could be really helpful in this seminar is to also offer a practical perspective from our experiences as young environmentalists, young activists from the international conferences we went to and spoke at, to sort of, for example, Sarah's book writing effort in her organization. So we collected a list of do's and don'ts for the interaction with decision makers, media, and the general public from the perspective of a young environmentalist. Please do keep in mind that the things we talk about are specifically targeted at climate activism, which is different to environmental activism if you look at regional environmental topics, because as we already said before, with climate change, it is very difficult to, in the beginning, have that emotional connection, and it's such a huge and broad topic. So it is very specific, or it is a very specific part of environmental activism. And without further ado, I would hand over for Sarah to kick us off with the don'ts. We thought we started with the don'ts to end on a positive note with the do's.
Exactly. So the first don't is a very personal don't. Don't forget that you have the right to talk about the problems surrounding the climate crisis, that you have a right to be angry or sad or scared, and that it's okay to let these emotions show. Don't let others dictate how you speak or feel. Your emotions are an incredibly powerful tool, and only talking about the climate crisis on a very abstract and scientific level gives us the chance to forget how much of a personal issue it actually really is. Every revolution and every big movement in the past was powered by equally big emotions, be it anger or happiness or sadness or fear, whatever. Anger can be an truly incredible catalyst, and sharing your fears can give people the feeling of being seen and belonging, being connected to you. And onto the second don't. Don't play into frames established by deniers of the climate crisis, but rather try to create your own frames and wordings. This is incredibly important if we talk about communicating the climate crisis, the issue of the climate crisis. Climate change is one of the prime examples in this discussion. Change in general is something good, something you shouldn't fear and maybe actively pursue. Using climate change removes any sort of threat in our day-to-day language and allows us to underestimate the devastating consequences of the climate crisis. It's also, on another point of this whole don't, it's also very easy to be lured into discussions where all you do is contradict the positions and frames of climate change deniers. This puts you in a much weaker position than presenting your own opinions, your own stories, and your own words.
So the third don't that we see really follows this logic of, not falling into traps set by others. We say it's really important that you don't let yourself be pushed into a situation where you are expected to provide solutions, where politicians, the scientific community, and businesses haven't found one. So, I think all of us working as young climate activists or people supporting young climate activists have always come across this criticism that young people protesting the climate crisis shouldn't do so because they are not having the expertise to do so because they are too young. But if they do so, they should not only protest, but they should provide solutions instead of highlighting what's going wrong. And, actually a very good defense mechanism to this sort of trap is to constantly highlight that, for example, with the Fridays for Future movement, the only thing we want is for countries to uphold their already signed promises in the Paris Agreement, so the Paris Agreement pledges, or any other international treaty for that matter. And this is a really good defense mechanism, especially when you interact with media in like talk shows, for example, where there are always some people that tell you, well, you should provide the solution if you are making the noise. And the last don't that we see, and we touched upon that actually, is don't fuel the generational conflict, but rather be solution oriented and initiate intergenerational dialogues. So we won't be solving the crisis if we leave parts of our society on the outside, and it doesn't help if we as young people are disrespectful of the realities that older generations have lived in, have faced, or still do face, and only putting the blame on them without being self-reflective ourselves, because obviously we as a generation, we are not perfect either. We are very international, we fly around a lot, so we also have our own problems that we need to address, and working together we are a lot stronger.
Then the next one is neither a do nor a don't really. It has positive and negative aspects, and that is identify multipliers to create a strong movement. All Fridays for Future leaders, or in general climate activists, have really strong networks themselves. And this makes it easier to spread the message and reach relevant decision makers, to create attention in the media, but also to get more of your peers to engage and to participate. However, it can also be a quite negative side effect that if you have one strong face or two strong faces, people who also participate feel like their voices are not as important as others. They want to be part of the movement as well. They want to be heard as well. That's one of the main reasons they participate. And to them, it can feel like they are being silenced. So this has to be used very sparingly and very carefully. And then onto the do's. The first do is identify one or two or several articulate spokespersons. And this has a very simple reason. Having someone articulate to represent the groups or movements' interests in a very professional way. They know what they're talking about, really adds credibility and really helps with media presence and also getting leaders, politicians to listen to you. And this is especially important if we're talking about the international context, where it's not assured that everyone speaks the same language. And it really helps if you can have people that are sure of themselves present the cause.
Another do that we see is totally linked to that articulate spokesperson argument. You should be as knowledgeable as you can and surround yourself with experts in the topic. As I already said before, one of the dominant criticisms is that young people lack the experience to be talking about a topic such as climate change, where there are still a lot of scientific uncertainties in some areas. And it allows you to steal your critics' thunder, basically, if you are very knowledgeable in the topic. And it also adds credibility to your demands if you are including experts in the topic, like, for example, scientists for future, because they are the ones that actually should be listened to on the content base because they are doing the work. And obviously that is very important for the interaction with decision makers and the media, and especially for panel discussions with partners that rather sort of argue on an emotional than effect base, which a lot of the climate deniers tend to do. The next do is, it's unfortunate, but prepare yourself for the top 10 climate change denial bullshit arguments. And it's simply, there are so many people out there that give arguments that are not 50% credible on a scientific base, not at all scientifically based, but they throw it around and they generalize and they sort of mix things together that don't go together. And if you prepare yourself for these bullshit arguments, like there have always been natural variations in the Earth temperature, one of my favorite ones, then you can on point answer or like contradict these sort of arguments, which are not really scientific arguments, but rather try to put you into a position of not being able to defend your argumentation.
And on to the last do, and my favorite do actually, is use storytelling as a powerful tool. Find an overall narrative that other people can take seriously and emphasize with. For example, the lack of climate action as stealing young people's futures. In this context, use language that has lots of metaphors, comparisons, that creates pictures. For example, explain tipping points or what a 2-degree increase in temperature would mean for the Earth at 39 degrees Celsius. The human body cannot function any longer, so does the Earth. And this kind of communicating is really, really important for the interaction with basically everyone. It's really important how you talk to decision makers, how you talk to the media, and how you talk to the general public, especially in topics that seem so far off that people cannot easily build an emotional connection to. And if you want a strong and passionate movement, you have to get people emotionally involved and engaged. So that was the last do. I hope it helps. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether there are any questions regarding that specific part.
Thank you very much for the do's and don'ts. We have had a lot of questions coming in, and I've been in parallel also answering a few of the open questions in the questions and answers section. We are a bit over time already, so I would suggest that we continue already and jump in with the panelist section. We are trying to keep answering a few of the questions in parallel in written form, and then have the time in the end also to discuss all together. All right?
Yeah, sure, perfect.
Let's go.
Okay, now I have the great pleasure of welcoming some wonderful panelists to sort of the stage, the virtual stage, we decided that you know, this is such an important topic with so many diverse perspectives across Europe, but also across generations, across types of activism that you do, that Sarah and me definitely do not really give the whole picture, and we need some more experts, specifically experts on the European field, or you know, the Europe, who have expertise with European institutions, who know sort of the sphere of environmental youth activism in Europe. And I'm thrilled to be welcoming 3 panelists. We have as a panelist here today, Lydia from the UK. Lydia is a youth work specialist who works with young people in the UK, both physically and digitally. And a majority of these programs that she's delivering are focused on the environment and leadership. And Lydia is part of the National Youth Agency, and as I read earlier, based in York, which is an absolutely beautiful city, and actually my first city that I've ever traveled to in the UK, so can highly recommend that. Hi to Lydia. I can't see you yet, but I'm pretty sure I will be in a second. Then we have Ileana from Romania. Ileana is a communication specialist and event organizer for the Romanian National Agency. She focuses on the youth sector and higher education in her communication tasks, and is also an editor of the monthly newsletter where she covers green topics. And she herself practices environmental behavior on an individual level, and is also very passionate about that. Hello, Ileana, greetings to Romania, also incredibly beautiful. We've been with a think tank in Cluj, absolutely lovely. Welcome and glad to have you on board. And then last but not least, we have Mateo from Croatia. I've seen Mateo has also answered a lot of the questions already. So glad to have you on board. He is a fellow climate activist working on climate change mitigation in Croatia, and a member of multiple environmental groups. I just mention a few because there are so many. He is a member of the Croatian local Green Left Party, the European Spring, Progressive International, and Young Europeans Federalists in Croatia. So absolutely thrilled to have you on board. And let's kick off this panel with the first question. I would suggest that Lydia, you go first, since we have covered the sort of youth activist perspective now, and would also like to hear from a youth work perspective. So how can the Erasmus Plus and the European Solidarity Core programs better support environmental activism among young people from your perspective?
Well, thank you so much, Johanna. First of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And it's amazing that so many people have joined this webinar. So what I would say is to go really back to basics, and a lot of you might cover this if you've been involved in youth work. So all countries in Europe and across the world are signed up to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that's all about expressing that young people have the right to express their own view and their opinion, and they have their right to be leaders in something that interests them. And this can, the way we do it at NYA is we sort of split it up into 3 sections. So just by Erasmus Plus and young people getting involved in the European Solidarity Programme, just them engaging in that is sort of the first step. And their knowledge and their awareness increases from being in that. The next stage I'd say is participation, so they're getting involved in the feedback of that, and they're getting involved in designing something, creating something themselves or within a team. The next step for me would be the youth leadership, so this is where they take complete ownership of that, and they go off and run their own project and really sort of enable themselves. Obviously along that journey, which sort of reflects on what you were saying, Johanna, earlier, is there someone supporting that person along the way, whether that's a youth worker, whether that's a teacher, whether that's someone in an extracurricular role, whether that is the climate strike movement with the youth strikers as well. There's someone giving them that support, emotional or knowledge support, really. I'm going to shut up because I know that there's other panelists, so I'm going to mute myself now and hand over to someone else.
Thanks a lot, Lydia. I'm glad to see that a lot of what comes out as a result of my research actually is reflected in, you know, your practical work. So glad that I wasn't too far off. I would now hand on to Ileana, maybe from your perspective, working a lot on communication topics, how would you say that Erasmus Plus and the European Solidarity Corps program can really support environmental activism across young people?
Thank you, Johanna, and hello everybody, and thank you for having me with you today. It's amazing how many people responded, and it's great news, and it's good to be in such an extended community. I saw there were some or quite a few people from outside Europe, and for those who don't know, I would like to highlight that Erasmus national agencies are institutions that implement European Union programs for mostly for education use and professional training, and for adult learning also, of the European Commission. Some of these institutions also implement the European Solidarity Corps, but there are countries where the Erasmus Plus program and the European Solidarity Corps are implemented by different institutions. To respond and go back to your question, I might sound a bit harsh, but you know, coming from communication, I have to say things as they are. And in my opinion, not going green in the very near future can be the next pandemic. We know for sure that almost 200,000 people died already because of this thing that we are all living, and because we are not seeing each other face to face, but in this online thing. And I was wondering, reading the news today, whoever counted how many people died or have health issues based on food or water poisoning, sea and ocean pollution or deforestation and so on. And not to mention the losses in terms of species of plants and animals. What we can do, we are in this situation and we have to do something about it. I mean, it's better later than never. And it's good to see that there are so many persons and so many institutions and so many initiatives that, that relate to solving this issue. Maybe you all know this European Green Deal, and I have to mention this because it also is approached and tackled by some initiatives coming and suggested within Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Corps. I saved the link and I can share it with you later. The two approaches that I was referring to are, and that are also addressed by the European Green Deal, and that can be also very easily implemented in European education projects, are recycling, which means an extending selective waste collection, and of course mobility. For the future programs, maybe you know, or if you don't know, I'm very happy to bring this as a total novelty to you. All the future projects that are going to finance are going to receive bonus points and extra days for not traveling by plane, but to reaching to more sustainable and more green means of transportation. And I hope this responds to your question.
Absolutely, thank you so much. Matteo, from your perspective as a young activist, do you feel like the European programs such as the Erasmus Plus program and the European Solidarity Corps are really influential in you know, achieving young environmentalism across the European youth? Or what would you change, and how could that better be promoted and supported?
Thank you very much for your question. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm so glad to see so many young people joining us and asking these questions. I believe that Erasmus is a great because it allows for young people cultural friendships. I believe the idea of a united and connected Europe can really flourish in this way because people from the young age can learn more about multicultural diversity and the differences that both set us apart and connect us. But as climate crisis is getting worse and the environmental collapse is nearing us, it is also very clear to guess that a lot of our countries and a lot of our people are going to either suffer or parts of the continent will get destroyed if we do not tackle the issue of the climate crisis in a timely and in a righteous manner. I personally think it would be really great if we were to have educational programs with the Erasmus Plus students who are going to another country where the native students can hold, for example, seminars, panels, or discussions about what the current environmental issues are in the host country, what is at stake, and what are the people doing to fix it, like politicians or activists that are, for example, marching. And I believe that it would be really great if the hosts were to organize trips, for example, with the visiting students to some national parks or important natural sites, especially those that are at stake of suffering from environmental and climate catastrophes, or maybe those that have already suffered, as to see how awful environmental destruction is. But of course, you can also travel yourself to other countries to see these things and to engage with the local groups to help them tackle these issues. These things that I've mentioned could be done, for example, through ESN. And if anyone is a member maybe of ESN or is active in similar programs in their area, I would kindly invite them to try and to propose such ideas.
Lovely, thank you so much. I really liked how, very different perspectives came together as practical solutions, ensuring that really youth leadership in designing these programs and ensuring that feedback is incorporated can make them tackle more of the important questions when it comes to environmental youth activism. We see that already there are steps towards making these programs more green by giving bonus points for more sustainable ways of traveling, and we can even try to make use these programs to be more aware of the differences of environmental problems and threats, and the differences of the threats that climate change poses to various European areas, and sort of feel more connected as European youth. Now, the last question that I want to ask, and I also include Sarah in this panel, is how can young people be better involved in decision making on environmental issues? And I maybe want to start with Ileana.
Well, yes, this is also something that I keep thinking about very often. I think it's a matter of personal choice. People, no matter their age, cannot be involved by force. And it's also a matter that can be reached by getting a critical mass. The moment a number of people will, and it's about to happen, I feel, and I think, and I hope, the moment you will reach this critical mass, the problems will not be so easy to be like not seeing. But I don't think there's a general solution to tackle the involvement of anybody in decision making. Maybe the intergenerational approach sounds very interesting, the one that mentioned by Sarah earlier, and also the emotional approach mentioned by you, Johanna, earlier. In the end, I think it all has to do with the personal awareness of people getting totally conscious about the environment they are living in. Then personal involvement could be the next step, and scaling up to the whole society. And of course, this requires a lot of support from WWF, Greenpeace, and so on. All these big institutions and NGOs and foundations that already know how to deal with these environmental issues. In terms of the Erasmus Plus program and the European Solidarity Corps, they provide context for young people to be better heard and better listened, because I think that it's much easier to approach the decision makers and present them with the results of a project that has positive effects on the environment, for example, than to just go and say, hey, I just want to get involved in whatever you do on environment. Just my opinion.
Johanna, du bist stumm.
Sorry, I was muted. Oh, well. Thanks a lot. I wanted to follow up on what you said with Lydia. So Lydia, from your experience as a youth worker, do you see rather structural barriers to environmental or the participation of young people in environmental decision making, or is it more emotional barriers? So what do we need to tackle to allow people to be active in environmental decision making?
So apologies, I'm going to base it on the UK, but I don't know really of other countries in Europe. So there has been quite a change actually due to the climate strikes, and more environmental organisations in the UK are opening their boards, for example, or their steering groups. Again, I'm not sure if that's translated into other organisations across Europe, and they are bringing on board youth representatives so that they have their own opinion on decisions being made. This is also happening in government as well, which was pretty historic when it happened. So due to the climate strikes happening, DEFRA, which is our Department of Rural, I'm not going to get the full acronym, Rural Farming Affairs, I believe, but it basically covers all our environmental stuff. They have created a steering group, which is just young people. So they give their opinions on environmental decisions that are being made, which is amazing. That's never happened before. I would agree that there are still barriers. You are, I think Sarah addressed this in her talk with FFF, you are going to have the same sort of young people who are going to approach those applications and approach those positions, and they will be predominantly, they have been white middle class. This is a situation that is not just in the UK, but across the world actually. And it is something that we're always trying to address, and environmental organisations in the UK have been predominantly white, which is something that they want to seriously address now. Though there are more and more opportunities opening up, so I think it is really positive, and I think in the future there will be a chance for young people to have their opinion heard, and we do on programmes I openly encourage young people to apply for stuff and to support them in understanding the environment that they're putting themselves into. So when you're on a board, it's a very different environment to a youth session, where we bring on activities that young people can use to express their opinion. But when you're on a board, it suddenly turns into the adult world, as it were. And you really have to support young people to get over that barrier and to really be able to express themselves well in that environment. And also, I believe that, again, political landscape of the UK, but when you're saying about going local instead of just looking at the global picture and encouraging those local role models, looking at parish councils, which are a very, very local sort of board in the UK, looking at them and encouraging young people even to speak at parish council meetings about environmental issues in their local village or say their local town, will give them that chance to change things locally and give them that confidence really to go on to do more. But now I'm going to be quiet again.
Thanks a lot. Love that. Love also the local approach, which I did see equally in my research. So Matteo, from your perspective, can you confirm what Lydia just said, you know, that there tends to be more opportunities for young people to get environmentally active in decision making? If yes, so how do you see that from your perspective, and what is lacking until we have true representation of the youth perspective in environmental decision making?
So I believe we need to have a much greater youth participations with these issues. Environmental challenges and the climate crisis are especially important for young people because it impacts us the most. We are the ones who are going to suffer from the results of these actions, or rather inactions, and it is important for us to be involved. I'm honestly so proud of people like Greta Thunberg, Isra Hirsi, or organizations like the Sunrise Movement in the US that are actively pushing for greater climate action and to stop the unfair use of natural resources for profit only. Fridays for Future and the School Strike for Climate are also amazing ways to bring these issues forward and to pressure our politicians into solving this issue as best as they can. So activism and marches are obviously the first step towards youth participation in environmental and climate issues. Next, what we should pursue is supporting young people to run for office and to be more active in the political life. We already have all the solutions to the climate crisis, and the climate and the environmental sciences have also been really thorough in their observations about the climate and the environment and what will happen if we do not act. Now it's the time to bring forward the solutions, and if we are to make young people more active, we need to support them to lead a more active political life as well. In the States, for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became the youngest person in the Congress at the age of 29, and one of the policies she's most famous for is the Green New Deal. Of course, she wasn't the first one to propose this. The Green Party pushed for it way back before, but she put it in the mainstream, and now there are lots of activists advocating it, especially young activists. So this is just one of the examples how young people can influence the questions of climate in the political sphere. We also need to encourage young people to vote and maybe to push our governments to lower the voting age from 18 to 16. Such proposals do exist, and I hope that they will bear fruit. And it is also important for all the young teachers out there who are teaching in various science fields to teach environmental issues to other young people, especially if they are teaching in grade schools or high schools. I've even personally heard from some of my friends that they have had some sort of an education in their high school and actually learned about some of the most pressing issues of the environment. And I believe that since this is a major issue, and it's especially a major issue today, that we should reform our curriculums and allow for subjects like these to appear in our education systems more. Some EU countries have already started doing this, and I believe that we should follow their example and implement them through the Europe as much as we can. Yeah. And of course, in the end, individual actions are very important. So learn about what you can change in your daily life, whether that is driving a hybrid car, changing your dietary habits, using recycled products, whatever you can do. You don't have to do everything and sacrifice everything, but just be more mindful of how your everyday actions can affect our climate and the environment. And you can even teach others these things, especially the older generation. And through this education of others, you can also help mitigate the effects of the climate crisis.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Matteo. I really love how you brought together, education and decision making, and I do like how you also emphasize the fact that we need more young politicians. And there is this wonderful UN campaign that is called "Not Too Young to Run," which wants to encourage young politicians to run for office. And I know that one of your points actually strongly resonated with what Sarah thinks. So Sarah, the last point on this panel is for you. Please do keep it very brief. I know you can. And then I hand over back to Salto PI.
Yes, I'd like to add on to Matteo and ask the question, why is it so hard for young people to be involved in decision processes? And I think there are several reasons, and we constantly expect young people to jump through hoops adults don't have to. And one of the main points, or one of these main hoops, is that young people, children, youth, are not allowed to vote. We can talk about how old they should be. There are different studies. That's a whole another webinar. But I do think that in democracies, every citizen's voice or needs or demands should be heard. And in Germany, 13 million people's voices are not being heard right now. And you see this in every other governmental institution right now as well, because young people, they don't have a vote, so they don't get to vote people into these institutions. But if we want to break it down a bit and make it a bit more simple right now and maybe a bit more doable, I think that right now young people are always in the situation, if they are lucky enough to advise, to demand, to maybe be a box they tick off at a conference. Yeah, we listen to the children. Yeah, we listen to the kids. And now let's do our stuff. And this is not an option. If we get to advise, I think we should also get the right to sit at the table and be part of the decision. And handing over the power to take decisions also means a loss of control in some ways. But it shouldn't mean a loss of control. We are also citizens of this planet. We have interests, we have needs, we want the future. So I think it's completely illogical that we don't get this vote right now, that we don't get to speak eye to eye to all these politicians, because what they are doing is they're making politics for us. When they accepted their vote, they promised to take care of us, to take care of our future. And what they're doing right now is completely ignoring this promise. They are not listening to half of the world's population. They're just ignoring it, ignoring our future for their own gains. I think that's not fair. And I think this is a basic issue in global politics, also national politics, that we should address. How do we get youth to be more involved? And if you give them the power to take decisions, to be part of something bigger, they will want to be involved. People want to be part of something. They want to choose. They want to make their own future. So I think that's something we should keep in mind and work on. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. I think that's a wonderful, last point to end our panel with, something that definitely needs to change in our societies. I just want to thank all our lovely panelists. It was so great to meet you. I hope that after the Corona crisis, we all get to meet in person one day, maybe at a conference or so. Keep up the great work regarding environmental youth participation and environmental activism. And I hand over to Salto PI. I don't know whom of the wonderful colleagues I'm handing to, but
thank you very much, Johanna, and thank you very much our panelists for joining us and sharing your thoughts as well. So at this point, we have been keeping track of the many questions you put out there. We've answered a few of them. We cannot answer some of them immediately. We'll do our homework afterwards and look into some of the questions further on. One thing that stuck out to me were a few questions about the impact of the current situation. And this is a short question I would like to address back to you, Johanna or Sarah. What is your feeling? How is this Corona crisis going to impact the societies, and where does this push us in terms of environmental awareness?
Oh, great question. So Sarah and we discussed that yesterday, but not short. We sort of discussed it for 45 minutes, so we're trying to keep it brief. I don't know, Sarah, do you want to go first? Or
no, you go.
Okay. So in my perspective, I see it as a threat, but also as a clear opportunity. So definitely what it shows us is that we are on the wrong path. We have sort of created that situation for ourselves by destroying ecosystems, by allowing viruses that used to be in, like, let's say the rainforest or in areas that were uninhabited by humans, come to civilizations. So it just shows, how we're screwing up. I do see a threat that we might lose track of the momentum on the climate crisis because, for example, the Friday for Future movement can't strike physically at the moment, can't put pressure on politics physically. And also we might, politicians might have the tendency to focus on economics over the environment when restarting our societies. But on the other hand, I see an absolutely clear opportunity to restart our societies in a more just and in a more environmentally friendly way. And we already see that with, for example, Madrid. They already decided that they wanted to change their sort of mobility system to a more sustainable one after the crisis. So we have a momentum that we need to use, that our politicians and leaders need to use, and we need to put pressure on those people in decision makings and also provide the solutions. Handing over to Sarah.
Well, you said everything. I don't think I have anything to add. Yeah.
You don't need to add more on this. I think, as you said, this is a debate that can go on for much longer. But I just wanted not to leave it out totally at this point. We are slowly coming towards the end of this session, but let's take a moment at this stage to look at this amazing and wonderful drawing that Siri has produced at this until now. I don't know. Maybe Sarah, what sticks out for you when you look at this amazing overview? Is there anything you would like to highlight?
It's incredibly beautiful. Firstly, it's wow. I like the wow. It's the first time I'm seeing it. I like the being part of something bigger. I think that's something that motivates a lot of people. That's something we should always keep in mind. The whole aspect of solidarity is becoming increasingly important right now as well with Corona. So I think that's something that intrinsically motivates us. Wow, I'm a bit overwhelmed, to be honest.
Yeah, there's a lot to look, and at this stage, I also can make a little advertisement. Of course, we won't keep this drawing only for ourselves. We are going to share it on all our social media channels and also on the new resource pool that we are going to link. So you find Salto participation and information on YouTube, on Facebook. There is a website, so we will share this amazing drawing, obviously, with you as well. So I might come to my the take away from this, or I can also ask you, Johanna, if you want to highlight anything from this amazing drawing first.
Can we please appreciate the poo next to the "be prepared for denial" bullshit? I really like that because it symbolizes how I feel very often when I hear these sort of arguments. But also, you know, just the fact that the intergenerational dialogue is very prominent as one of the key things to keep in mind. And also the fact that climate activism is always linked to social justice topics. I think that is also something that we as a society need to understand. If we are more sustainable, everyone will be better off. And that's sort of the way to go and the way activists are fighting for.
That is great. That's amazing. And I can connect to that really well. One key takeaway that I see here is basically very simple, but yet so complicated. It's about cooperation. So cooperation is a key in this. And we also saw this in the questions, raising the issue of cross-cultural cooperation. So what about the other regions? Even further away from Europe, the cross-sectoral cooperation, it's really important to point out, to listen together, to work together, to share resources and practices and learn from each other. And last but not least, what you said, the intergenerational, cross-generational dialogue, because we are in this together. And the good news is that the EU youth programs are in this. They want to help and support this endeavor with in this, and also as we heard in the panel, we want we as the programs, the EU youth programs, want to support this more and better than ever before. So at this, I like that the key is now also there in the drawing. So at this point, we are coming towards the end, and we have a few last messages and announcements that we are going to share with you in a second. So this webinar of today is not the last one. We had one before. The recording is there and available on Facebook and on our resource pool. But we have 3 more coming up in this series where we look into the bigger question of how to make youth participation more visible, how to do this. And the next one coming up on 7th May, and you can register already from today on, is making youth goals visible. There is the 11 youth goals that have been developed in a participatory manner across Europe, and have become essential part of the EU youth strategy. So one of the youth goals is also really much connected to the environmental topic. It's the Sustainable Green Europe youth goal, number 10. So this will be tackled on the webinar on 7th May. And 2 weeks later, there will be one on inspirational practices from participation and information projects. And the last one, early June, on promoting youth participation. We hope that we'll again be able to welcome you as participants. Yes, still having so many guests in here, and look at the numbers, that's really great. Do we have another slide here? Yes, we do. Yes, we have not released it yet publicly, not launched it yet, but we are sharing with you the link today already on the participation pool that we have created to share resources on the topics of youth participation, on media, information and critical thinking, and on promotion and outreach. So the address where you can find all these resources is participationpool.eu. All right, thank you very much on this. So we have come to an end. Maybe a final look to the drawing at this stage. Or are we going to be? I'm wrong. Yeah. It was not foreseen. I'm confusing all the plans we had. So take a final look at this amazing drawing. And I think at this point, it's time for us to say goodbye.
Oh, one more thing. Before you leave, we would like to ask for some feedback from you.
Yes. And I think we have prepared poll for this, have we? Yes, there is the poll showing up. So at this point, we would really, oh yes, numbers are coming in, and by now you have really good practice in how to use all our great webinar functionality. So we already have over 50% who voted, 60% voted. We have maybe, let's give it 20 more seconds, or yeah, 20 more seconds, and then we close the poll and show you the results as well. Question to my colleagues in the meantime, is there anything else that I was supposed to announce at this point? You can jump in here and help me out. All right. We're doing fine, I see, with sign language. So I think a few more seconds. A few votes are still coming in. Closing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Closed. Thank you very much. So 7% say it's quite okay. It was quite okay, the session. 46% say they liked it somewhat, and the majority of 48% of participants who voted gave us a superb for it. Thank you very much for this. And at this stage, thank you again to our speakers, to the team in the background, still here, and also on Facebook. Thanks a lot, Siri, for your amazing work. And thanks for all the attendees out there watching. Have a great weekend all across the world, and goodbye.